It's in the dark now, so nobody can see what I look like anyway. Okay, that is Louis XIV. Louis liked fur, apparently. In the mid part of the 18th century, when the French and the British had their big battle and Canada went to Britain, Madame de Pompadour, the next king's mistress, said it really didn't matter because the only thing that Canada could do that was of any value was supply her with fur. So, just to give you the view of what Canada was seen as. But it is interesting because, in fact, the hunting of fur was probably the first real industry in Canada outside of the First Nations communities who hunted for survival, of course. But look at the amount of dead ermine there is in that cape. And theoretically, invisible because it's in fact the lining of the cape. I put this in. This is an English painting from the 1740s. The man is in a buff-colored coat. That's actually going to be made out of buckskin or some sort of light-colored processed leather. It might have been a domestic animal, but at the same time it could be deer hide or something like that, just to make the point. Her skirt is going to be supported by panniers, which are side hoops, and her body's going to be encased in a corset. For the more expensive of those, they were stiffened with the whalebone. And I think that piece of whalebone that's going around right now is conceivably 18th century. I got a whole package of them wrapped up in a very, very old piece of paper. And they use boning exactly like that in the 18th century in the stays and right into about 1840. They're exactly like that. And this is how the whalebone would be encased. This is a set of panniers, more or less. Anyway, it's of an oblong hoop form. And you can see the channels right there where the stitching is, and that's where the whalebone would be. The whalebone pieces aren't long enough to do this, so they bind them together and overlap them to create the length they like. If people are talking about whalebone, they usually will claim that whalebone or baleen was used first in fashion, and you have to be careful of when they say first of anything, in the 12th century when they had the shoes with very, very long pointed toes that curled up, and they used whalebone to stiffen those toes to keep them in place. So this is a set of 18th century stays here. It's sometimes in the 18th century, the stays on the bodice are sort of amalgamated, and then you'd use a separate skirt in the same fabric, and you create the impression of a single garment. Now, the stays would be stiff in the body, and they come right down into these points here. So the stay actually starts here and go right up to the armpit. And when this is on, these splay out over the hips here and give a better support to the end of the boning. Whalebone is also, because it is so strong, it's less likely to snap. If you use low-grade steel, this was a important issue later on because at this point they're still not likely to be using steel because it was too heavy and too coarse. But low-grade steel would corrode, rust with the perspiration of the wearer, and when the corsets were laced up tightly, if they broke, if they penetrated the skin, you'd get blood poisoning and you could die from it. So it's not only the pressure of the corseting that can do you harm, it's the raw materials themselves. Now, this is not about baleen, this is about animals and the popularity of leopard print. Leopard print. This is actually, this is out of one of the German exhibition catalogs. These garments here are, this one here anyway, that one's a bit earlier. This is from the 1770s. It's a brocaded silk fabric, probably French, but not necessarily. So we have a clear background, we have floral bouquets floating in space here, and that meandering line is meant to look like leopard. Exotic fur always had some sort of value beyond the obvious. It isn't about protection or keeping you warm or what have you. It's about status. And the more exotic a fur is, the more valuable it is seen to be. So here, worked into the weaving of the fabric, it's actually done in silk, not in fur. But I just make the point because everybody likes to think that leopard prints happened in 1956 or something or other and were unique to somebody like Jane Mansfield. That's not true. They've been making fur look-alike fabrics for hundreds of years. Even fake fur pile goes back a very, very long time. Now, feathers. This is Gainsborough, I think this is Gainsborough from the 1780s. And just to make the point that feathers on hats were always popular. Now, he doesn't have a hat with him as far as we can see anyway, but oftentimes men's hats were as decorated as women's. Plain hat, but with an extravagant ostrich plume. The feathers were beautiful, they move well, they're exotic because they'd have to be imported. This is an English painting. Also, they add height to a figure. So they give you a greater sense of presence. You are becoming more remarkable. In the 18th century, the earlier part of the 18th century, the figures emphasized width, and they used baleen to establish the width of the garment. That was about showing off the qualities of the fabric. That's where your status comes from. Dresses like that couldn't support fur coats. So fur, if it's used, tended to be used as scarves, as trimming on a mantle or some other kind of wrap. But the skirts themselves, if you put a fur wrap over that, you destroyed the shape of the dress, and also you just look like a mountain of moving fur. So you have to think of these things, again, at several different levels. So after the French Revolution happened, it was quite conspicuous. The width of the figure becomes less important, and the height becomes more important. Fashion is always a series of actions and reactions, and that's what you see here. And they're using the feathers to exactly do that. And you see it right there. This is the 1790s. Those feathers are called panache. That's what those objects are. You are wearing a feather panache. And if you wear something with panache, it means you wear it with bravado. You have attitude, you are brave, you are spectacular, you are larger than life. And it comes from the world of the military, because the military officers in particular, but enlisted men as well, if they were in a wealthy regiment, they would wear helmets with a feather cockade on the side. And the logic was supposed to be, first of all, so they could identify their own soldiers in the battlefield, but also to taunt the enemy. Ha, 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 you can't shoot me. Bang. Well, I mean, it's ludicrous, of course. And in the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, soldiers were wearing camouflage. Now, as I said, this is the 1780s here again, around the time of the French Revolution in 1789. So, but the look is sort of the same. My point with this being, it's about fur accessories, not fur garments. And it looks to me in this instance that it's either fox or perhaps sable. This is a French painting, I believe, but you can certainly see the size of that muff, and it is indulgent. There's a whole collection of muffs that belong to various French kings. There are muffs that I've seen in exhibition catalogs that belong to various popes. And it is about prestige. And to make the point, there's a man wearing a fur muff. Now, I use this slide often for, well, usually when we're talking about the history of men's clothing, but I like it because it's so interesting. This is about 1810, 1814. That's one of Napoleon's generals there. And this is the neoclassical period where women were wearing dresses that were transparent and they thought they looked like Greek statues. I think he thinks he looks like a Greek statue, and he's just a bit too fond of the shape of his bum. Because it is interesting, that's the only part of his physique which is actually truly defined. But he's got a fur piece draped over his shoulder. Marching bands still, if they have them, they still use leopard skins for the bass drummer and things like that, which, of course, nowadays is highly inappropriate. But right there is his helmet. And that's going to be made out of fur. And the palace guards at Buckingham Palace still wear big busbies, and traditionally those were made out of black bear fur from Canada. It was one of Canada's traditional gifts to the royal family. Now, I believe they use artificial fur now. So just to let you know, don't write a letter to the British consulate. It's not their fault. It's something that has changed. This is a French painting done in Paris in about 1804. My point with this, these are people selling ribbons at a stand in a public square. And he is a poor man, obviously, but even at that, he is wearing fur. Now, it might be that he is also the third owner of that hat, because in those days, clothing was seen as property. And oftentimes, even a hat like that might appear in a will. I am dying, I am leaving my favorite hat to my grandson, Fred, or something along that line. So just to make the point, but for the most part, for the poor, it's more about comfort and protection than it is about status. But there's always going to be an element of that in the public view. I've already worked corsets a bit here, but I thought you would find this amusing. That is a man with his servant putting on his corset. This is 1818, I think it is 1820. This is an English caricature, and of course they're making fun of him as a dandy here and the shallowness of vanity. But it is about corseting, and again, that would be stiffened with baleen. It's deceptive here because they've actually got him putting the corset on over his clothes. But that's because of the sense of propriety for the day. He would have actually most likely put his shirt on and then put the corset on and then the rest of the clothing. Now this one I put in, I actually have a parasol. This is really going to be a parasol. You ever see a parasol and an umbrella? An umbrella protects you from the rain, a parasol from the sunshine. I didn't bring it this time, but if anybody does wish to see it, you can speak with me afterwards. I'll give you my card. I have a parasol essentially identical to this, and I would have brought it to illustrate ivory, but this time I brought fans instead. And the ribs of the parasol itself, under the canopy, are made of whalebone. And again, it's about strength and flexibility. They're also very, very heavy. So it's an odd sort of combination that you have to keep this up above your head for perhaps hours at a time. The Museum of Vancouver has a man's umbrella from the 1780s or 90s. I can't remember, it was so long ago that it came in, from Scotland. And it probably weighs 10 pounds. Now, this is the Queen of Spain in the 1820s, the end of the 1820s, and I put this one in to draw attention to the feathers. Those are bird of paradise feathers, which would have been extremely exotic in Europe, but by this time, of course, the expansion of colonialism throughout the world by almost every one of the European countries is just a given. So those would have come to Europe from Southeast Asia or some such place, Southeast Asia. And in that instance, the feathers are naturally colored. There are quite a few different variations of birds of paradise and slight coloration differences and so on. Usually what survives is black or green or sort of amber colors, and this helmet-shaped hat here has some of the variations on its as its ornament. They are remarkably beautiful, but generally speaking, we say they look better where they grew. Now, coral. I put coral in because I suspected you wouldn't think that I would mention coral. So I brought that one coral bracelet. This red coral, it isn't the animal itself, but it's the protective mount that the animal generates to live its life out in. And then once the animal has died, then they harvest the coral and they work it into absolutely spectacular things. But greed and avarice, of course, have played their role in the exploitation of these animals. And nowadays you cannot buy this kind of coral anymore. It is against the law to harvest it. And if you do find a contemporary piece of coral and it's this color, it's usually been dyed. I'm not suggesting that you hunt this out, but if you go to an antique jewelry auction and you see this kind of coral, you can understand the appeal. The color is something else. It's absolutely spectacular, one of the most rich, intriguing colors imaginable. These are all pieces of jewelry from the well, it says here 1830s. I would have thought a little bit later than that, but certainly early to mid 19th century. The necklace is meant to go in a dress with a very wide open neckline. One of my models the other day when we were doing a fitting for a show we're doing soon, she said, I always think jewelry looks best against the skin. Because we were debating about whether or not she should have pearls against the dress. And she said it would be better against the skin. And I never thought about it. It was absolutely brilliant. Now, this is, I think it's Burne-Jones, but it's one of the pre-Raphaelite artists. And here is a woman wearing coral beads. This is the 1860s here. I think it was done in 1869. And obviously she's a character. I imagine it's actually meant to represent a person from literature. Her fan right here made out of pheasant feathers. But it is about complimenting her. They don't care about the end. And it's successful. You got to admit that it's absolutely superb. So, another parasol here from the 1850s in this instance. The handle is actually jointed here. There's a metal collar that slips down the handle to hide the joint that's there. And the idea would be that you could fold it in half and carry it under your arm or in your hand. Okay, a fan. Well, what we have here. False teeth, often carved out of ivory. I have 2 books on the history of false teeth if anybody wants to get into the history of false teeth. It's all about presentation, what people do to change their appearance. This is actually a relic from the Napoleonic Wars. Belonged to one of the British officers. You see the Prince of Wales plumes on the top there. Beaver fur felt hats. Huge industry in the early and mid 19th century. Now, whether or not these are fur felt or whether these are silk ones, I can't say. I do not have a beaver felt hat. When they show up, they are extremely valuable. But it was one of the major industries, one of the major motivations in hunting beaver in Canada in the old days. Now, this I put in, I couldn't figure it out when I ran through them a moment ago. This is about bustles. In the 1850s and 60s, the skirts tended to be supported by hooped petticoats, and they were stiffened with cane or steel. But at the end of the 1860s, they got rid of them and they wanted them to be smaller, and baleen sort of came back as an option for supporting the shape of the skirt in the form of a bustle. So this is 1878. This is the kind of bustle pad that's worn inside that. This ties around the leg here. This is actually soft. We wired this for an exhibition. And those little belt buckles that you see there go in behind the legs, and they are attached to the ends of fairly long bones that are made to bow out and support the skirt. And those are often made out of whalebone or baleen. By the mid part of the 1880s, the bustles become more extreme and more exaggerated. As you can see here, this is 1883. And there is a little bustle of this type. I got this one in Powell River. It's actually got whalebone boning in here, which is fastened with clips on the end. So you can unclip it under here and they will go straight and you can roll it up and put it in your suitcase. and that will support the skirt, and this one does the same. So it's all hinged, and it works like a cantilevered bridge. People always want to know, how did you sit down in a bustle dress? Well, there's one of the ways they got around this. The other option was to have the back of the chair open so you could push your back end out there. Tiger claws as jewelry. This is from the 1880s, most likely. And in the 1880s, they were particularly fond of dead animals and bits and pieces. So what they had here is tiger claws, but they also used hummingbird heads. There's, in one of Cunnington's books, he talks about young women going to a ball in London in the 1880s, and one woman is wearing a dress which is decorated with taxidermed kittens. Kittens. I assume she thought it would make her look cute. Shell cameo. I didn't bring anything that was cameo, but again, if we're talking about animals, shells tend to be prolific, or animals that produce them are prolific. So it's not an endangered species, but of course there are variations. And abalone here, we've had problems in the past. I think it's doing all right now, but abalone is one of those things that has had an issue. 1880s, feather boas, or fur boas, just to show consistency. Always, always in the norm, in use. This is 1910, just making the point that it's not just women. Here are men wearing mostly raccoon coats. I looked at the raccoons in my neighbor's backyard last night. Well, I don't mind the coons, it's the skunks that I have problems with. Anyway, this is an advertisement for a furrier in Montreal. And it's charming to see a polar bear killing a seal. That's a real selling point, isn't it? Can I have the coat that has the teeth marks in it, please? Now, 1890s, so a little bit backtrack here. But my point with this is, you see it earlier as well, but there's a huge emphasis on bird parts. Theoretically, what was considered good taste was using either feathers or flowers on a hat, but never together. If you used them together, it was considered a confusion of seasons. If a hat was fashionable, it should have flowers in the spring and summer, and fur or feathers in the fall and in the winter. Fruit was dependent on the time of year. Cherries for the spring, I suppose pumpkins for the fall, but we won't go into that. Anyway, this is the 1890s, and you see the use of bird wings, as well as single feathers and pairs and so on. What can I say? You'd think anybody wearing that hat would smile. Feather boas. I love the picture, though. Doesn't she look like everybody's perfect, idealized grandmother? And another one just to make the point. Feather boas everywhere. We're going to use one. We're doing the Bad Taste show on Monday for the women of the Rotary. Now, this is 1906. The hat's getting bigger and more exotic all the time. And this is when you really start to get into this time of massive exploitation. This is inside the same magazine, and the woman on your left-hand side, look at her hat. 2 complete birds there, as well as some exotic feathers, which have probably been altered to create those curlicues with the little ends, little teardrop-shaped ticks on the end there. This is a cartoon out of Punch magazine. This is 1908, and they're making fun of this affection for exotic animal parts. Presumably, it's mother and daughter, and they are shopping. And the mother is wearing a turban of a real seal. A toque or a turban was a style of hat of the period, often made out of seal fur. Her neck scarf is also another seal. Her muff is a domestic house cat with a fringe of dead mice. The daughter has very wisely taken the tiger skin rug off from in front of the fireplace, the one that grandfather killed in India, no doubt, and has used the head as her hat. the forelimbs as her stole, and then the back legs are hanging down below. And her muff is a lynx with a dead rabbit in its mouth. I don't know if you've noticed here the dog having a cardiac arrest here. He doesn't know which thing to bite first. Now, look at the feathers in that hat up there. The others not so much. Here's a large ostrich feather and whatnot. So this is the same year as that cartoon we just looked at. This is the Woodward's mail order catalog printed in Vancouver. I mention that primarily because if anybody has a hat like this with a Vancouver label in it, I want to know. I've only ever found three or four hats of this style that are local. Not one of them has a label in it. I have other hats, but they're from other places. So this is out of that Chic Parisienne hat catalog there, just to show you the classic. The layered plume, and sometimes they'll take 4 or 5 quills as well and laminate or tie them together to create a luxurious plume. Those are probably egret or osprey feathers or some other water bird. The secret is that they have to have volume, color, drama, and no weight. That's one of the reasons the feathers are so popular, because the hat has to be light. This is the Western Farm Monthly, printed in Saskatchewan, I think it is, and I think this is 1911. If you couldn't afford a full fur coat, then mantles and muffs to match, coordinated little outfits like this were really important. $7.50. I have these, at least I hope I still have them. They've been packed up for ages. I thought I had to put this in because I figured you'd be going to sleep by now. This is, it's a gimmick, it's a trick. And the photographer had the ostrich and a box camera and would charge you to have your photograph taken sitting on the ostrich. And if you look right here, you can see that the ostrich is nailed to a base. So, but she looks rather self-conscious doing this, but I think it's terrific. Here's the ostrich head right there, you can see it. So it looks like she's got very peculiar legs of her own to begin with, and then you start. I got that in the Salvation Army thrift store on 12th Avenue in probably about 1968. So it's almost as old as I am now. Anyway, again, this is designed by Paul Poiret. And just before the First World War, they got into Empire Revival, and then they get into Orientalism. And this is a little bit of both. We have a dress here with a high Empire waistline and a long, slim skirt, and she's wearing a helmet. It's actually reminiscent of what women would have worn in 1810, 1812, around the time of the Napoleonic Wars. But they're reviving that, and her helmet is supposed to look like a helmet worn by an ancient Greek soldier. So they would have revived this in 1810, along with neoclassicism. 100 years later, they're doing it again, and there's that panache. And I have a blue panache sitting on one of the magazines right there. Then the Orientalism comes in, and fewer feathers, but exotic becomes more important. And by this time, the panic for the feathers has made them more difficult to find because they've just about killed everything already. But also, popular taste was changing. And they did anticipate the First World War before it began in 1914. And a touch of sobriety is starting to come into this. But there's also this affection for the organic nature of Japanese style. So the dresses are meant to look like kimonos. And in the Japanese tradition, of course, they did wear large headgear as well. But a lot of times the more important aspect is elaborate hairstyles. And that is also evident in a lot of Western fashion at the time. Chinchilla, a wild animal, which I assume now is farmed. But this is about 1913. That's an American actress. Trimmed with fox bits here and there, of course. This is a photograph taken, I believe, I couldn't remember whether someone gave it to me and it was taken in California or if it's from Calgary. But she's wearing a sealskin coat, which comes to here. This is the hem of the coat here against a black dress. And a matching muff, and the hat is beaver felt. Beaver felt hats have a very long nap to them. as opposed to other felts which tend to be very smooth. But she's obviously very proud of being covered from head to toe in dead animal bits. First World War, economy, practicality become an issue, and you will still see fur, but it's much more likely to be used as some sort of element of trim rather than a complete garment. This is 1917. This is about 1919. The clothing that much more modest. The war was taking all the money, and extravagance was seen as improper. This photograph, as far as I know, was taken near Boundary Road and Kingsway. And here we have our dead animals, in this instance, true animals. And it's from here on in, you're much more likely to see these fur scarves, which are a single pelt. One of the reasons, certainly not the only reason or the most important reason, but one of the reasons I started getting interested in the history of clothing is going to church. And the woman in front of us with the fur scarf on, and I'd sit there looking at this dead animal, wanting to touch it, of course, when you're 5 years old, and never really quite making sense of why you'd have a dead head around your neck. I mean, if they would use the mouth and clip it to the neck of the woman wearing it, I could see that. It's going to have a little bit of impact. You're going to be intrigued. Nothing new on vampires. Anyway, this is a dress by the designer Lucille, who was in reality Lady Duff Gordon. This is one of the British entertainers, I can't remember offhand who it is, anyway, wearing one of her dresses trimmed with mink. There's a coat to match, and the coat is even uglier. This is one of those sort of one of everything dresses. What on earth was she thinking of? When I say, I can't believe she wore that dress. This is one of them here. Lady Duff Gordon was on the Titanic and survived, which is a tragedy. You can take that any way you want. Okay, mother of the bride dress worn in Winnipeg in 1924. And the accessories are not original to the dress, but this is exactly how it would have been worn. And those fox pelts were actually useful in the 20s because they wore them around their neck to fill in the thinness. They wanted a plain geometric rectangular form, and that's what they're striving for here. The head should go right there on the right shoulder. That's the traditional way to wear it. Monkey fur. This is out of a magazine called Art Goût Beauté, Art, Taste, and Beauty. And in the 20s, when the garments became so simple and the body shape disappeared, texture and color became really, really important. And also once King Tutankhamun's tomb is open in the winter of 1922 and 23, a true exoticism came into popular use. And here it's an exotic animal, it's African, so there's a relationship to Egypt as well. The animal doesn't come from Egypt, but there you go. Ostrich feather fans, hugely popular in the 1920s, as they had been in the world of ancient Egypt. In the ancient world, they didn't fold. But the Chinese invented folding fans thousands of years ago, and by the time they're being reinterpreted in the world of fashion in the early 20s, they are folding fans, and she thinks she looks like an Egyptian temple dancer. That is the logic here. And they came in infinite varieties of colors and sizes. Woodward's mail order catalog, Vancouver, 1928. Fur coats. And the furs put in an Art Deco pattern. So they've cut and pieced the pelts to create an Art Deco formula here. In the 30s, Depression, not a lot of money. So if you can't afford a full fur coat, at least you can afford one with fur collars and cuffs. And they will keep you warm. And most of these coats, when this is Eaton's printed in Regina, in Winnipeg. It's a Canadian one anyway, for sure. And the coats are lined in leather, chamois or something or other, so that it'll stop the wind in the great Canadian winter that we don't have to deal with. So this is a street photograph taken here on Granville Street. If any of you has any fancy photographs, The Museum of Vancouver is collecting them, and they're getting ready to do another exhibition. And they've hired me to actually make some comments about some of the gals here. I think this is great. She looks like she's confident and strong and whatnot, and she is obviously very proud of those furs. I'm sure they cost enough. But now, during the Second World War, fur was still popular, but once again, feathers come into huge popularity with the fashionable world. This is a French photograph. The French women tended to wear very large hats during the war. I think, well, the rationale is presumably about morale, trying to cheer yourself up. But a lot of clothing in the participating countries was restricted by raw materials and the war effort and so on. So one places you could indulge was in headgear. And certainly in England, millinery was not limited. Other clothes you had to get your quota, but millinery was not restricted, and that was because the government felt it was important for morale. A lot of large Edwardian hats were cut up at this time. I've heard a lot of stories of, we went into my grandmother's closet and we got our old big Edwardian hats and tore them up. Post-war, indulgence, goofiness, larger than life. And we've got a couple on display out here in conjunction with Catherine's exhibition. They are wonderful. And if you're using domestic fowl, or the feathers from domestic fowl that has been bred and slaughtered for food, then perhaps it's a little bit more palatable, no pun intended. I thought this was appropriate. Fake fur. If you need a fur coat, there are so many highly successful options which are artificial. Go for it. They've been making artificial fur since at least the 17th century. So by now they've got a pretty good hold on it, and they come up with some pretty good stuff. Or if you really, really need to get a fur coat, buy an old one in a vintage shop where that animal's already dead, and throwing the fur coat away is a shame. It's nonsense. This is a coat by Norel from 1958. The Costume Society that I'm with, the smock, we have a dress from this same series that has a flounce of red ostrich feather about a foot deep around the outside edge with the matching wrap done from this same series that Norel did at the end of the 50s. It's absolutely wonderful, but a lot of feathers. Now, when they harvest ostrich feathers, they don't kill the bird. They clip the feathers and then they regenerate and so on. Alligator, this is by Courage in the 60s. Now, it might be vinyl, but the ad says that this is real leather, so. 60s, mini skirt, but she's still got fur. This time it's one of those fur helmets. The 60s, the dresses are so simple and abbreviated that really, a lot of times fur is not really going to work for you. But here, this is an evening dress by Yves Saint Laurent, and it's all ostrich feathers. And it is wonderful, especially if you don't have any figure, because it doesn't matter. A lot of the appeal in clothing is it creates the incentive to touch. And of course, if she lets a guy touch her, it's a privilege and it's a step closer to love or what have you. But the temptation is part of it. Angora sweaters, just think of Angora sweaters. So I put this in because by the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, this is when the whole hippie thing happens, the counterculture, and we question everything. And the exploitation of nature is no longer acceptable. There was a movement just not that long ago, a year or so ago, I heard somebody said there was yet another revision of the Bible happening, and they were going to change the phrase, and man shall have dominion over the animals, to and man shall have custodianship of the animals, which I thought was a great idea. 70s, Persian lamb, body to the coat and then trimmed with fox. So presumably domestically raised animals here, at least the Persian lamb. 70s again, just for continuity's sake. Christian Dior, this 1979, made out of, I think it's Breitschwarz, which is broadtail, which is unborn lamb. They slaughter the pregnant ewe, and then they skin the fetus to get the fur. Are you with me? Netto leather here in Vancouver. Now, we can't condemn Netto because their leathers are going to be from animals which are bred for food. So just to make the point, though, that the exploitation, or at least the usage of animal parts, still goes on. We wear shoes, of course, handbags. But animal prints are the best bet, okay? Except for Madonna, who seems to think she's better than the rest of us, and she can still wear white fox furs. I just put that in as a joke, more or less, just to make the point that it still goes on. But, you know, it isn't necessary. Okay, thanks very much. That's my time.